I think you can see from a lot of the talks here, and I was listening to Ben Decker too, it's a good prelude to my own talk. We are getting into inspirational, ideational, and to a certain degree, idealistic understandings about going through. We're going through the thought processes of thinking into and feeling into new possibilities. A lot of the work that I've done is taking that thinking into and learning into and feeling into and translating it into new practices. New options and directions, and also being alert to the opportunities that we have around us. So many of us in spiritual circles have been taught to be judgmental and unintentionally about our practices, about whether or not we are spiritualistic enough. And if we aren't, then things don't go well for us. Or I tried calming breathing and I was not calmed at all. Or I tried aspirational, attractive thinking and it didn't attract things for me. In a lot of ways, we are going to be maturing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, beyond that kind of rather simplistic thinking about spirituality. In the writings that I've done, and in my own understanding, spirituality is an energy. It's an energy, it's a conscious energy that moves through us, that moves between us, and it moves among us in our economies, in our societies, in our morality. And there are certain stalwarts that help us in not only managing that, but letting that energy expand, radiate, and develop within us and between us. I've always been a very strong fan and advocate of the inner meeting the outer. So much of typical discourse has been unfortunately limited to saying, well, there's the outer world, which is the world of things. Most people consider that the lower world. Then there's the inner world, which is the world of spirit. Well, we are human beings, and we weren't here to simply be dropped into this world. We chose to be here first. And secondly, we weren't here to simply just disabuse ourselves of the illusion of this world and then escape back into the spirit again, okay? We're here, I think, in many, many very important ways to integrate the inner and the outer, okay? The objective aspects of ourselves as human beings, what some people call the lower mind, the emotions, and even the intellect is an aspect of this lower mind, though it's the higher aspect of it, and also our bodies. Sorry about that. I think I didn't turn off the alert on my computer. But anyway, the idea there is to integrate these things, intersect the inner and the outer, and me and you. And the notion of economy that is central in terms of spirituality and transformation, including spiritual and moral transformation, is recognizing that that is not a conditional enterprise, and then combining that with that world that is oftentimes run by conditional rules. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is this. Each one of us has a birthright, an inherent original genius that comes to us through the spirit, that is brought into this world that is nowhere else in the entire cosmos and the entire universe. That becomes our currency, our gift to each other, our gift to ourselves, our gift to God, our gift to larger spirits, larger cycles. And that is essentially at the root of a truly spiritual economy. We have to understand that inherence and intrinsicness of our spirituality and its uniqueness as an individuated form in this human being, to understand that each one of us has intrinsic value that cannot be taken away or duplicated, period. And economy is about diversity, distinctness, and exchange. We have the distinctness in this unique divine genius. Diversity is the desire to include and embrace others who have this distinctness instead of being intimidated by it. So that's diversity. And finally, exchange. It's divine genius in relationship. And relationship is where a lot of us fall down, and is a lot of where our real evolution and our maturing and the real invitation we have in this time in collective evolution as well as individual evolution. Relationship is a difficult one. And really, economy is about exchange and relationship. A lot of us have gotten down the distinctness of our own individual path. We've talked about Kundalini awakenings. We've talked about the ways in which we can come together, a new kind of politics. Ben Decker talked about that. But we're sort of on that precipice. We kind of feel it, but what does it actually look like? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done that talks about what it looks like. I have written a book called Transforming Economy from Corrupted Capitalism to Connected Communities. I bring a lot of these practices out. I don't have a lot of time to go through them. I'll touch on a couple of them. But I want to help you understand the contours of this, how we're moving from an ideational, inspirational, more thought-oriented, more feeling-oriented phase into one that's more applied, where this is actually going to be the thing that leads our world and our leadership in the world. There's a big hazard here, and I know that a lot of you have experienced this. If we become too enamored of our thought forms and our feeling forms, and we can't separate mere spiritual, mere emotion from spiritual feeling, we can get trapped. And we see this with conspiracy theories and so much of what's been taking over the social media, which is just plain old delusion. So we are in a really kind of critical moment right now. How do you separate, inspired feeling from just delusion? Well, let's look into that. Let's first of all identify where we are. Right now, we have had, and we continue to have, the habit of the empath and the narcissist. And many of you have been on spiritual sites, have written books about this. But the dynamic is basically this. One, with an effort to dominate, oftentimes by opposing the lower world onto the higher and using creative power and innocence for its own ends to victimize it. And the other trying to defend itself against that and still maintain that sensitivity and spirituality. So we've gotten into kind of a dynamic of attackers and defenders, okay? And really, I see in this day and age a much more potent type of spirituality emerging, of co-creators, instead of defending, which is a reactive impulse. What you have now is something that's not aggressive or dominant. It's not active in that sense, but it's active in the creative sense and in the collaborative sense. And it's not a mamby-pamby kind of collaboration. Well, can't we all get along and let's be all civil, the sort of neoliberal version of it. It's a much more powerful and progressive, not just spiritually progressive, but politically progressive, but spiritually progressive notion that this life is meant to be lived. This divine genius is meant to be identified and developed in children and adults alike. It's meant to be shared, and our institutions, if we even have institutions coming out of this, need to emanate from the morality and the commitments of and the conclusions based in that sort of facing. Now we have in us, like I said, the tendency in our spirituality to hide, endure, escape, or transcend. And in so many of our practices, we're trying to get out of this crazy world. And I don't have any problems with that on a basic level, okay? On a basic level, we all need to have our fun time, our fun foods, our ways to even use breath to get away from things. But we also need to use these kinds of methods to get towards something. And that's where things get a little bit scary, especially if you're sensitive, emotionally sensitive, especially if you have psychic abilities, especially if you have abilities to prophesize. A lot of that can be besieged by this energy that's going against this transformation. And it's easy to get depressed, especially when you don't see a lot of evidence of some of these changes. But that evidence is out there. And I wanted to go ahead and begin to look at it, okay? Again, extending what Ben said, and this is completely independently. I had already written, some of this up, and I've done a whole series of videos on COVID-19. If you go to citizenzeus.com and click into my Citizen Zeus YouTube, you will see this. And I've done a series of interviews, a lot of it on spiritual economy with my wife, Regina Meredith, and you can find that at reginameredith.com. A lot of you know her from Gaia. She does open minds in Gaia, so I am her husband. So, and finally, we are also starting a neighborhood called ourneighborhood.earth. So if any of this is interesting to you, you can go to that. But what we said in some of these interviews was very interesting. She interviewed someone named Carl Kalman. A lot of you probably know him. He's done a lot of the Mayan type of stuff. But in the last 400 years, we've had a cycle here of very active, sympathetic. Now, your nervous system has a sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic. The sympathetic is the ramping it up nervous system. The parasympathetic, and if you're talking sexuality, it's ramping up to climax, okay? And then after climax, you have this kind of cascade down. That's your parasympathetic response. Well, we have these 400-year cycles, according to Kalaman, in which we do this kind of sympathetic response, and then we do this reflective, more nascent, more coming to some kind of reflection, to rest, okay? We've gone through, since the so-called Enlightenment, this hyperactivity. And you see it in our economics, you can see it in our politics, of always aggressively trying to outdo ourselves. You can see it in our individual lives with suburban lawns and so forth and so on, always trying to outdo, get the bigger house, get the bigger portfolio, have the more lavish vacation. And then along came COVID. And what did COVID say? I'm going to signal the end of this big sympathetic bump. Active, always growth, not paying any attention to what the earth can withstand. And I'm going to force you into a reflective, parasympathetic response, one in which you are going to be forced to be a part of from each other, out of the entertainment, out of the sports. Everything's going to be closing down. It's going to be a winter, but it's going to be a very fruitful winter for the spirit. The spirit is going to say, wait a minute, this stuff is not sustainable. It's not even valuable. I don't even really miss these crazy commercials and TV shows and endless jockeying for another promotion at work and so forth. Instead, we have to be together. Instead, we have to deal with our own emotions, and relationships that were parallel relationships now have to meet each other. And apparently there has been a kind of a record of divorces and so forth as a result. Another one of our first speaker talked about that. So now we're into this quiescent kind of era. And what are the opportunities offered by this? In terms of relationship, in terms of economy in particular, in terms of moral and spiritual economy. Well, now we have the opportunities to start to keep from externalizing everything, and not just internalize them and not to separate the two, but to bring the two together. What is an economy going to look like, or morality going to look like, in which the two of these do come together? I talk about this in my book, but I'm going to go ahead and share a couple with you. The first is this. We are going to be moving from a possession-oriented culture to an experience-oriented culture. We're already seeing not just signs of this, but serious evidence of this. Even something as simple as people no longer buying CDs and doing it on these sort of wireless connected services like Spotify, where you can bring up the music, okay, without actually purchasing individual objects, is an example of that. The idea of the good life being not so much about the things you own, because they take a lot to insure, a lot to maintain, they start owning you. Now an idea is starting to go in people's minds, I don't want to be owned by my stuff. I don't want to be attached to it. I want to be able to go on trips and not just have my house cluttered with a bunch of objects that I've owned. So we're beginning, and what does this do by going from possession to experience? What does this do? Well, it helps loosen us up toward that creative potential in us. When we are slave to our objects and slave to our roles, and objects are not just objects that we buy, but statuses, stereotypes. You see, each one of these is an objectification of a much more fluid, more spiritual process. In my mind, again, to identify spirituality, it is an energy. It's an intelligent, conscious, connected energy. It's not an idea, it's not a belief, it's not even a faith. Faith is how you deal with spirit, but spirit itself is this. And I've written a book on this that was too advanced to be released, but I think I will edit it in the next couple of years. So another part of this is we're going from human capital, in which people are being used essentially as fodder for a machine that sees their labor and sweat as simply just a liability to pay the least amount for in order to get to concentrate wealth. We're going from human capital to relationship capital. Now we are beginning to see that we are dependent upon one another. Even nations that were former rivals, like China and Russia and the United States, are beginning to realize, I mean, it's not always the greatest because it's consumerism that drives China. If our economy falls in the United States, for instance, China's economy suffers because they depend on the US consumer market. Putin's oil suffers. It goes down as it did during the COVID-19 virus outbreak down. And now, I had skipped on the big opportunity that COVID is presenting us. Many people rightfully understand that COVID is not something to be tarried with. It is saying in no uncertain terms, I'm here. It's wiped out a lot of especially older people. It has made us be much more concentrating on our health and the decisions that we've made. And I think one of the greatest things that has helped us with regard to the whole COVID thing to avoid far more deaths than we have is that we've actually taken the time to stay home and sleep and be in this reflective, more relaxed state. Now, what can come out of this besides some of these things I've been talking to? What's our world going to look like? Well, one of the other things that I've also said that our world may look like is we're going from being a passive consumer to an active producer and co-creator. Now, I talked about going from this active, frenetic hyperactivity, something more reflective. Aren't I contradicting myself? Well, actually, no. When I say passive consumer, what I mean is reactive and having things stimulate us, hype us up. The blue light from our computer screens and our phone screens, making it more difficult for us to sleep. Always seeking another peak experience with other people, always amping. And yet, if you look at it, most of those things aren't created from us. It's not that we looked inside and we said, this I'm really committed to. I want to go out and do this. It's fed to us, okay? We're passively consuming, but the effect that it's having on us, the reaction it's having on us is amping us up. It's saying, produce more, work more, buy more. Is that what our Spirit's asking for us to do? No, the Spirit's asking for us to connect more, to get rid of the distractions, okay? Not to simply live as a monk, okay? But to simplify our lives, begin to understand what's important and what the costs and trade-offs are and the ways that we live our life, to create this balance and this connection between the inner and the outer. That's what we have, this opportunity. And we are well advised to take that opportunity. So COVID is doing that. It's helping us go from that parasympathetic or that sympathetic ramped up response to a parasympathetic relaxed response. But ironically, that more relaxed response, more dependent on spirituality, rather produce co-creation and spirituality rather than consumption, is going to make us more effective. But the way in which we're going to be effective is different. It's not just going to be creating another personal record or bumping up your salary. It's going to be how much you can help to improve this being, share, and help to improve the world, rather than the individualistic markers that we've been taught and segmented and siloed into believing. We're going to have to break from that. What are some of the other features of this world that's emerging now? And I'll provide some examples. We're moving from a material to a more non-material existence, okay? Even things like going from gold and coins to something like Bitcoin, which is virtual currency, is a small example of that, okay? We're beginning to realize that holding on to things and having tangible objects, we don't need that as much now. We have memories, we have the cloud, we don't necessarily always need a hard drive. And so we're getting confident with the notion that there is an actual reality, memory, and coherence to a world that's not centered on objects. And I think, again, there's danger there, okay? But the good side of it is this: by not clinging to objects, including objectified forms of our own identity, status, gender, et cetera, okay, allows us to be more fluid. Now, there's a danger here as well, okay? Because I still believe in the fundamental virtues. In terms of the spiritual virtues that are still very active and important: compassion, courage, creativity. Three of my 7 C's. If you read my book, Spiritually Confident Man, I go through all 7 of the C's, okay? But it's not simply just about no longer having any commitments. It's a deep commitment that's meant to express courage, express creativity, and express compassion and share it, rather than to just hold it in the mind, okay? And rather to cling onto some object or some identity. Okay, let that identity be expressed, shared, and challenged. Okay, we're not going to be hiding, escaping, transcending, or enduring anymore. We're going to be facing, coming into presence in, with connecting. And this is going to be a very vulnerable time for all of us. It's going to be a vulnerable time for societies as people try to take advantage of that. It's going to be a very, very vulnerable time for individuals who are going to be experiencing, not only within their own makeup, but in their relationships with loved others, some serious disruptions, as we're seeing already with COVID bringing out and ending relationships and shifting relationships. So what are some of the other things that we are running into? Scarcity. We're moving from a scarce culture where value is dictated by the more something was shared, the less valuable it was. Now we're moving to a society where the more something is shared, the more it increases in value. An example of this is learning, and not learning that's partitioned out by high-priced institutions of so-called higher learning, but actually beginning to share knowledge on the YouTube, sharing knowledge like we are doing during this emerging sciences seminar, which allows people to freely engage this and begin to link up with it. And again, where's that going to head? We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it's not going to be one in which ideas and important learning is commodified and the gates are closed. But rather, those gates are going to be open. And for the most part, if they're not free, at least it will be voluntary in terms of donating to support someone. I do this on my website, and I don't need a lot of money to live on, so I do it freely. And then also this notion of spirituality from individual going toward community. In my book, I talked about from corrupted capitalism, one of the engines of corrupted capitalism is the self, the ego is the most important thing. So now you have 2 different rules, one for the hyper wealthy, where they never get thrown in jail, taken into account, and one for everybody else. That's got to change. And part of that is engaging, as Ben Decker said, in the politics of spirituality, in the economics of spirituality, and not simply just donating to a good cause, though I support that as well. So in my book, I talk about some of the examples of this. Let me see how much time I have here. Okay, let's see here. Looks like we have about 7 minutes or so. I talk about this. One example of this I believe is going to have to come forward, is debt forgiveness. In the Bible, jubilee or debt forgiveness was considered absolutely critical. And from an economic standpoint, has to be. Economies in the world does not go up forever. There are cycles, okay? Debt, on the other hand, is a very unnatural and artificial type of system that says you have to pay off. In fact, you get debt added on debt as the interest rates go up, basically forever. The Bible understood, and other religious traditions and moral traditions understood, that debt cannot be paid. Those two end up departing and never coming back unless debt is forgiven. So we have that. We have debt forgiveness as an example. I have a whole chapter in my book, Transforming Economy, about this debt forgiveness. So that's one example of it. Another example is this, of sharing. Worker-owned enterprises. Places, companies like Bob's Mill, some of you have had. What are some of the other ones that are also workers owned? King Arthur Flour, that's one my wife talked about. And also I think even Winco is one of these worker-owned cooperatives, allow for people who are producing not to be simply used as fodder, as human capital, but the fruits of their labor to be reinvested in their company and for them to get a nice portion of the work that they put in the form of actual salary and benefits. So that would be another example, and that's already developing now about this happening. So what is another example that I have here? And I have a few of these in my book. I would encourage people, I've written a series on this for my friend Charles Hugh Smith at Of Two Minds. If you look under the 3 C's, or you just Google my name, Zeus Yiamouyiannis, I've done a whole series of 5 of these, whereby I really lay this out. And I lay these examples out and how they're transforming this situation. But another example is local currency. Local currency is a great physical example of this moving from a materialistic, objective, external economy to an internal, spiritual, connected one run by divine genius and sharing. Local currency is a voluntary currency that you have in your community that keeps the money circulating and flowing there. They've used it in places like Cornell. They've used it in places I'm thinking Cornell, they've used it in certain kinds of farmers markets. And basically it says, we are not using money as a barrier or as a tool of power. We're using it as a tool of connecting and sharing. A lot of times you're given premiums, and like movie theaters that have open seats, you can pay for that with that in local dollars, but what it's doing is create relationships in your community. So, and let's see if there's a couple of these other ones I have here. I talked about farmers markets, urban gardening. Oh, here's another story. Here's an interesting story, and I'll just go ahead and finish on this one. It was interesting, I passed this around in our neighborhood.earth, that the original notion of the lawn, the neighborhood, suburban, and lawn, was originally concocted over in England by the lords of the manor to show everyone that they were not laborers. They could literally have their lawn tailored and fallow, full of just grass. They wouldn't have animals on it or anything, to show you that they were not those low laborers. And now we're turning that over. We have urban gardening. We're turning those lawns into productive Edens, where we can share with neighbors and enhance our own abilities when we have pesticide-free fruits and vegetables right at our beck and call. In fact, there are whole programs out there trying to create whole communities of exchange around this. So these are just a few of the ideas. My time is mostly up right now, so I'm not going to continue onward with this, but I wanted each one of you to do a little thought experiment in your head in consultation with your spirit, okay? And start thinking about these things and what it may look like in your personal life. As you see some of these principles, just let them sink in from this talk and from some of the talks of the other speakers. What's coming up with you about a new way of looking at things, and therefore a new way of acting in the world? And I would encourage you, if you get some insights about a new thing to do or a new way to think, to actually act on that. And not just be satisfied with the pleasure it gives your mind or your heart to think about it. So with that, I will go ahead and just put that out there as a nice, compassionate, and creative challenge for you as a community